Hi, I'm Paul Stringfellow, Technical Director here at Gardner Systems, and welcome to the latest in our Technology on Demand video series. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the importance of data protection when it comes to Office 365. Office 365 has become a huge part of many of our customers' IT strategies and has become a massive part of their COVID response. Many of our customers shifting lots and lots of workloads into Office 365 in double quick time. So one of the things that comes up, and it's often a conversation, is the importance of data protection. Do we need to back up Office 365? If we do, how do we go about doing it? And that's one thing that we're going to cover today. So to help me to do that, I'm joined by our special guest from Veeam, Karinne Bessette. Hi, Karinne, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing great. I'm a technologist at Veeam Software, and I work a lot with the side of having the conversation of why you would need a backup in the first place, and then how to make sure that you're choosing the best solution for that backup.
Well, that's handy that's what you do, because that's kind of what we want to cover today. So that's good. And I think there's a couple of interesting areas that I'd like to kind of explore with you around the reasons why. Because I think for many people I had this conversation with, there's often a conversation of, well, don't Microsoft just kind of do this? And also I wanted to maybe take a little bit of time discussing, I think, one of the most challenging areas that we see when it comes to protection in Office 365, and particularly when it comes to recovery, and that's Microsoft Teams. Teams has become a huge part of the day-to-day activity for many of us. And I think what we're starting to see now is that retrospectively, many enterprises are starting to go back and look at, we've deployed Teams, now we need to go back and maybe fix some of the things that we did because we had to do it at speed to enable our businesses, our enterprise to continue working. So they're kind of a couple of the areas that I wanted to kind of choose today. But yeah, why don't we kind of jump into it? And Rin, I'll kind of hand over to you. So maybe we start there. Let's have a chat about why we need to protect Office 365 at all.
A great intro into this topic, and to kick it off, I want to talk about the remote workers aspect because we are definitely in a transition right now. We are working more at home than we probably ever thought we were going to do in the next 10 years, and we had to do it overnight. So there were a lot of remote devices. There were BYOD devices because there just wasn't the equipment to send out. And all of these devices kind of open you up to an additional form of attack. So I know I have Office 365 on my phone, I have it on my computer, and probably a half a dozen laptops around my house. And I'm an IT professional, and I can almost guarantee all of those are not up to patch for to start off with. And security patches can be a huge vulnerability. And when something's not necessarily on your network, which requires a policy in order to update, you can kind of fall behind there, especially home routers. Home routers have updates probably monthly, but most of us don't even know those happen in the background. And they patch because there's security vulnerabilities that get exposed, and that can also leave you open. And of course, public Wi-Fi. Anyone that has heard anything about public Wi-Fi in the last years just knows it's a breeding ground for all kinds of attacks. And knowing simple tools like maybe being on a VPN whenever, anytime you're ever connected to a public Wi-Fi is a good idea. But these trainings and getting all of this information out to our end users to make sure they're not becoming a security vulnerability to us has been a huge impact on making sure you have protection of that data remotely. Have you seen a lot of that at your company, Paul?
Yeah, I think it's actually one of the biggest challenges that we've seen over kind of the last few months, while we've been increasingly working with teams around Office 365. And it's exactly that. Actually, this kind of one of the huge benefits of Office 365 is this kind of ease of collaboration and sharing. Of course, one of the biggest challenges of Office 365 is this ease of collaboration and sharing. And I think we're seeing that hugely. And that kind of piece you mentioned actually around mobile devices, that's a real concern to many organizations we deal with. How do you, particularly if we want that flexibility of people using their own devices, how do we make sure that we control, secure, and protect the data when somebody's using the kind of latest iPhone to allow them to access these kind of core business assets that we hold within 365. So yeah, it's absolutely something we're seeing on a huge scale and on a regular basis.
All right. That's an excellent description of what we just went through. That takes us directly into the 6 reasons why. And the 6 reasons why are dedicated to why you might lose data. And this is something that we actually surveyed the field about. and asking end users, what kind of data loss have you experienced in Office 365? And of course, the number one was accidental deletion on that list. And the accidental deletion, I would say I've deleted a file before. I'm sure you've deleted a file before. And we're like, I hope that's in my recycling bin because I forgot where I put it. That's the most common. It's just human nature. And then retention policy gaps. There are certain recycling bins inside of Office 365 itself, and that's what it's called, the soft delete cycle. But they also have what's called a hard delete cycle, which deletes that data forever. Between the hard and soft delete cycle, it changes depending on whether you're working with SharePoint, Exchange, and OneDrive. And in some cases, corruption of a file is non recoverable even within those hard and soft delete cycles. So if you go in and your version of a file is already gone, but maybe it was altered and it deleted an entire section of your document, you may not be able to recover that depending on what your configuration is inside of Office 365. The next two or the middle options here, I kind of see as two sides of the same coin. A company's worst nightmare is always going to be a rogue administrator, and an administrator's worst nightmare is always going to be something like ransomware or threats of ransomware. Working through these two different sides are just protecting your infrastructure in layers, making sure that not one person has access to everything. Make sure that one person maybe has configurations from Office 365 like JIT, just in time access. They only get that access if they've requested it and have it for a very short period of time. This audit process allows you to make sure you're not giving any one person too much permission and leaving yourself open to an attack. And then, of course, making sure that your firewalls and your networks are very secure and not just relying on one layer of firewall. Make sure you have endpoint protection. Train your users. Training your users can be one of your biggest early detection for any type of intrusion coming into your network itself, because they're going to notice it's slow. They're going to notice something's not quite right. And if they're trained to automatically think, okay, something's not right, I'm going to go tell my administrator, you can save a lot of headache in the end. Legal and compliance is a huge conversation. Paul, can you talk a little bit about how you've helped people meet that legal and compliance regulations for, especially over there in Europe?
Yeah, so again, I think it's a real interesting challenge that we see that people are constantly. I talked before about one of the huge pluses of Office 365 is this kind of ease of collaboration and be able to collaborate at scale. And of course, one of the downsides is this kind of ease and ability for which we can share information and share it successfully. And and that does present some real challenges, particularly in certain industries that we're working, where those organizations have some very stringent requirements. So for example, there's some people we work with in aerospace who have particular customers who are very sensitive to how their information is shared across their infrastructure. We have healthcare and public sector bodies who have tight regulations around the kind of sensitivity of the data that they hold. And Office 365 does allow us to implement some really secure compliance and kind of a retention policy type of stuff, and actually things that are really difficult for people to do on premises normally, that kind of traditional IT approach, building that kind of rights management and that kind of legal hold and legal retention policy driven architecture is quite difficult to do on premises. But actually the public cloud and Office 365 specifically starts to make that a lot more straightforward. So it's a hugely important element of 365. It's something we talk to our customers all the time as they start to plan or begin migrations into Office 365, the importance of taking advantage of some of these kind of enhanced data security controls, because as you've talked about actually in some of those other reasons that you've discussed, a lot of the risks around the data in Office 365 are not particularly infrastructure risks. We'll kind of touch on maybe this in a moment. Where traditionally where we would present and design our data protection solution, we'd be designing that data protection solution to probably mitigate risks such as hardware failure, loss of a data center. Once we start to move that into a software as a service platform like 365, those problems are no longer ours, but our problems are absolutely a focus on, well, what happens if we lose data? How do we make sure that we protect it, and do we make sure it doesn't leak out the organization, or if it does, or we lose it out of the organization through an accidental deletion, for example, how do we make sure for documents that where we have some stringent compliance requirements, because of course, as you'll know, one of those compliance requirements is often, can you recover it if it's lost? So it's a huge area of Office 365 and something that we have a lot of conversations with many enterprises about.
It's an excellent description of a real life scenario. So, our last reason we have here is going to be managing hybrid deployments. Now, hybrid deployments can be kind of a headache and it can be kind of I don't want to say volatile because it is a very solid system Microsoft has offered, but there's many ways that you can migrate your data, and fully understanding each way that you can migrate that data up to Office 365 can kind of alter the way that it's going to look on the other side. What we can do within, say, our software, we're able to back up not just an on-premises environment or a cloud-only environment, but also a hybrid environment. So we can do backups of your data prior to that migration to kind of give you that peace of mind instead of worrying about maybe a resume generating event. So hybrid management and deployment migrations, this is something you definitely want to make sure you're taking a backup before you move up to the cloud infrastructure. And that brings us to what's called the shared responsibility model. A
Well, I
lot
just
of
sorry, Ray, I
yeah.
just wanted to kind of throw in a question there. So one of the questions we have, and and I think some really good ideas, some really good points in those kind of 6 reasons, and I think that's it should give people an idea of where we can lose data inside of Office 365. But certainly one of the questions that we have, and we consistently have, we talked about data protection in 365, probably for as long as Veeam have been talking. We certainly spoke to our customers about it. But one of the pieces of feedback we often get is, aren't Microsoft protecting this? You kind of touched on some of those things that Microsoft do in terms of soft and hard delete cycles, retention periods. Is there a case where, well, what Microsoft are doing is enough and they'll protect your data, or do we need to think differently?
So I like to start the conversation off with kind of a shocking statement. Um, Backup may not be required for every person, but it's likely required for your organization. There are very few fringe cases where you're not going to decide to have a backup once you fully understand what the implications could be if you don't have one. Knowing that you have litigation hold and e-discover or hold on your email, this is a great first step to maybe a compliance or regulation that is out there, but it is in no way a backup. An e-discovery can only query the data and export that. There is no restoring back to your original location. There are limitations on the granular search and recovery options. There are very defining limitations when it comes to what is a legal solution to an IT problem, is kind of the conversation we like to have. And the shared responsibility model kind of lays that out and makes it a lot broader on what you should be protecting yourself, at least even according to Microsoft. And that brings us right into what is the perception. The perception is that Microsoft is responsible for the infrastructure as well as the data itself. But in reality, the customer is responsible for that data, meaning any type of long term retention, being responsible for whenever the hard and soft delete cycles are, or if an administrator wipes the data in the infrastructure, or someone gets a hold of an account that's an administrator account that wipes the data in the infrastructure, they are not responsible for any of that recovery. We've seen time and time again, and you'll see reports in most major tech news sites where some type of rogue application came into the infrastructure, deleted maybe all of their team's data. And Microsoft will come back, and you'll even see the reply letter where they were not responsible for making sure that that data was recoverable. They're only responsible to make sure that that application layer is available with the data it's on the underlying hardware. Have you seen any cases in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not necessarily quite as quite as terrifying for a user as that, but I think it's certainly one of those areas that this kind of piece that you're sharing here in this slide, this kind of perception versus reality, and I think it's important that people understand that. And I suppose, yeah, I thought you made a really good point before, actually, in that idea of the kind of the shocking statement that not necessarily all users will need their data backing up inside of Office 365. And I think that's a great place to start when you have this kind of data protection conversation, because I think it's important to understand, and this is why this kind of discussion around shared responsibility is important, because I think it's important to understand what Microsoft do for you, and natively what kind of data protection and data retention capabilities they have. And then I think it leads on nicely to what should be that important question around: how does what Microsoft do match up with your organization's requirements around data protection, data retention, data recovery? And if those two things don't marry up, then we need to look at some way of bridging the gap. And I think, this is quite a good way of leading into that conversation. I understand what Microsoft do, understand technically what they can do, what they're responsible for, and see whether there's a gap between what Microsoft offer and what you offer. And I mean, have you got any more detail about what Microsoft do offer when it comes to the shared responsibility model, what Microsoft do cover?
So, what we're going to cover next is actually the full breakdown of the shared responsibility model itself. Now, before we go directly into that, I want to give a little bit of a background of what this is. The Microsoft Shared Responsibility Model is a breakdown of all of the cloud offerings that Microsoft offers, from the IaaS, PaaS, and software as a service, which is what we're going to be blowing out here on the screen. And it defines what a customer is responsible for compared to what Microsoft is responsible for in any of their cloud relationships. Now, what most will find shocking is that Microsoft is responsible for that underlying data. They're great at redundancy. They're great at making sure that you have an access server available, but the access control to that data is within the responsibility of the customer. What this means is that any type of full backup retention, or making sure that you have a copy stored at a different location, is on the responsibility of the customer themselves. This also means that they provide an access level to or an access point to their infrastructure. But if you have a compromised set of credentials that alters any type of data, Microsoft is not responsible for those compromised credentials. So they're allowing anything that comes in, they're making sure they're accessible to you, but they're not responsible for any type of alterations of that data itself. They do again have that recycling bin, which is called a soft delete cycle, but that again only covers you so far in this type of a relationship.
Yeah, and I think that's that's a really useful representation of kind of where that responsibility lies, and why it's important that I think people do understand that ultimately the data, the information that we hold with inside of that 365 platform, while it's Microsoft's job to make sure that that platform is accessible and available to us as often as as often as possible, it's important that we understand that the responsibility for what we put in there lies with us. And I think that goes back to kind of the point we were making earlier on about how um, it's important to understand that there's this break of responsibility. So there's this responsibility that Microsoft will do the infrastructure, you're responsible for the data. And while Microsoft offer a level of data protection inside of Office 365, it's important you understand whether that meets your requirements for what you're trying to protect in Office 365, your organizational data protection policies, because if it doesn't, then it's important to kind of bridge that gap. And I think that leads us on, interesting, to kind of one of the other areas that I wanted to ask you about, was one of the things that obviously we've seen hugely grow over throughout 2020 has been the use of Microsoft Teams. Teams has been a massive part of certainly a lot of the enterprises we deal with. It's been a huge part of kind of their COVID response. It's been a big part of the way that they've been able to continue to operate as an organization, and making sure they can communicate internally with their staff and communicate with their customers. But I think one of the things that people don't often realize is that Teams brings with it a whole bunch of challenges. It introduces security challenges, and it introduces a particular challenge around data protection, and particularly around the recovery of information from Teams. And I kind of want to touch on that with you, because obviously a big part of something that Veeam's announced this year has been version 5 of their solution for protecting Office 365. And a big part of that release has been the support for Microsoft Teams, without stealing the thunder of this slide that you just presented. But I maybe just wanted to kind of explore that a little bit, about why Teams presents this very particular challenge, and why it's only now that we're seeing, we're seeing an organization like Veeam only now really start to deal with this problem. So what's some of that background around why Teams is so difficult to protect, and why is it a big deal that we can offer such granular and quick recovery?
So, yes, version 5 is going to include Teams. It is probably one of the highlighting features, I would say, of this release. There are some great other features like performance and some flexibility in proxy deployments, but this is going to be our head of this product release. And the reason that it is so important is to understand what Teams is. Teams is a collaborative interface for a lot of Microsoft backends offerings. So whenever you send data through Teams, it's actually sending through different data entities. First of all, one of them being Microsoft Exchange. Whenever you have a conversation with someone within Teams, that actually saves on the Exchange backend. If you're working on a channel, you're actually working through your SharePoint sites. If you ever sent a document through Microsoft Teams, you're actually sending through OneDrive. So it uses a lot of their backend collaborative interfaces, and what these all have are special metadata that is underlying that allows it to connect to know who is talking to who. Now, prior to now, we never had an API from Microsoft to be able to tap into that team's underlying data. So we were able to back up the Exchange side, the SharePoint side, and the OneDrive side and restore that back to the end user, but we couldn't necessarily restore it back to the original locations because we didn't have the metadata linking to those original locations. Now we do, and we've incorporated that API into version 5, and this allows us to restore granularly channels and tabs and all kinds of permissions and settings back to the original location. Now, why is this so important? I would say if anyone has ever tried to restore a Teams or channel back to the original location, you understand why this is so important, being able to restore back into a few steps instead of the 7 to 10 steps that are listed in the Microsoft documentation on their website themselves. It is, for lack of a better way to put it, kind of a convoluted process because you have to restore each of these data segments on top of each other in order to be able to restore back to the original location. And what we've done here is we've recorded the metadata and put all of those processes into an automated, easy to use interface, which is just like our previous team or our previous explorers, which makes it look like a file explorer, meaning that you don't have to learn the application. You don't have to learn what is a channel permission set. You're able to restore those back to the original location just by knowing, okay, this is the name of the channel.
I think that I think that complexity can't be underplayed as well, and it was one of the reasons that we were keen to do this on-demand video with Veeam, particularly around this kind of launch of Veeam Backup for Office 365 version 5, because I really wanted to explore this idea around Teams, because we talked to a lot of customers and we've seen a lot of solutions presented to many of those customers, particularly where we're acting in an advisory role, where the idea of protecting and particularly restoring Teams, because I think, as you've just said, the idea of protecting the elements of Teams is relatively straightforward. It's important that people understand that Teams itself is not really an application. That Teams client that we see is kind of an aggregator for Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, a couple of other services that sit within inside of 365. And why you can protect all of those individual elements, and there's lots of vendors in the market today who can protect those individual elements, I think it's very easy for them to kind of skip over the idea that when it comes to recovery, as you were saying before, in that stitching together, that kind of 7, 8, 9, 10 steps to stitch back together a team site that somebody has been deleted is not a trivial task. There's a lot of work that goes with that. And when it comes to data recovery, I think it's crucial that whatever our data recovery process is, it's not lots and lots of work. People should be able to trust it. It should be straightforward. They should be able to click a couple of buttons and go, there you go, there's my data back, and my data back where I expect it to be, not my data back somewhere else where I'm trying to protect it. So I think it's a hugely important, I mean, it's great to see it in version 5, but I think it's hugely important that people understand, if they're using Teams in an organization, how complex Teams is and some of the challenges that it presents. So so I think it's great that we're getting to see this in V5, and that Veeam are taking that kind of explorer approach that people who use Veeam or familiar with Veeam are more than familiar with, and it's nice to see that Teams is being integrated into that. And hopefully, before we wrap up, we'll perhaps for people who aren't familiar with Veeam, we'll get a chance to see a little bit of how they can recover Teams. I mean, is there any other particular areas around Teams that's important for people to know?
I would say that understanding all of the granular search items that we have to offer make it easier or even easier to be able to support teams as, say, a help desk. We're able to do granular searching, which I'm actually going to show within the demo that we have here in just a couple of moments. But knowing that your team software can search across channels, making sure you can restore entire channels or an entire organization of channels, knowing that you have flexibility and choice there can help greatly when it comes to any types of teams interactions. Permissions, if you get them wrong, we have the ability to be able to just restore permissions without just restoring all of that data or overwriting data itself.
I think that kind of flexibility, and that's kind of thing I wanted to kind of maybe wrap up on the kind of the presentation before we go into kind of the brief demo at the end. Um, I suppose maybe that was one of the questions. I think one of the things that appeals to me with Veeam's approach for backing up Office 365 actually is some of that kind of thing around flexibility. You know, it's flexibility of deployment, flexibility of recovery options, and maybe you could talk a little bit about some of those options that we've got and how Veeam go about protecting Office 365 for their customers.
With Veeam Backup for Microsoft Office 365, we're able to back up not just an on-premises environment like we're talking about earlier, but we're able to do cloud and hybrid deployments all within the same console itself. But we have the flexibility to also send out to object storage if you prefer, instead of using an on-premises storage, especially with how volatile data can be within SharePoint and OneDrive sites. The data can explode overnight depending on who you have accessing and inputting files and presentations and documents onto the data entities. With this, it gives you the flexibility to also be able to deploy in a completely OpEx situation by using an IaaS or an infrastructure application from the marketplace, which has Office 360, Veeam Backup for Office 365 on it. So this gives you complete mobility of your data, and there is absolutely no lock. And you're able to change your mind at any time, copy the data over to the entity that your business and everything makes sense for at that time. With this, none of your restore operations are altered. You're able to restore back to the original locations of any of these entities. If you have an on-premises deployment that you have a hybrid environment, you can restore data back to your on-premises environment that was originally in the cloud environment. You're also able to send out an email directly from the application itself, which allows you to not have to download, export, move over, and then send back out that file, but directly email any file back to an end user that's requesting a document. So there's a ton of restore operations that are available here.
I just wanted to pick up actually on something there, and again, I think it's something that's not often considered when people look at how they're protecting Office 365, and it's that hybrid data protection element. So you know, while you talked about it, it's possible to kind of deploy Veeam backup for Office 365 in these kind of multiple ways. So we can deploy it on premises, or we can deploy it as not as an infrastructure service inside of one of those you know, inside of the cloud provider of your choice kind of thing, via a marketplace. That hybrid stuff, and the reason I think that's important, you know, and you asked a couple of times earlier on about you know, some of our customer experiences when it comes to protecting Office 365. And I think one of the things that often gets forgotten is that for a lot of customers, particularly customers who are quite large, that they may well exist in this kind of hybrid infrastructure for quite a long time. They'll be having mailboxes and SharePoint sites remaining on-prem, while some users and some SharePoint sites, for example, are sat inside of Office 365, and some data there where they're using Teams. And those kind of hybrid infrastructures will exist. And I think for a lot of solutions that we see in this space, they will protect the elements that live inside of the Microsoft 365 cloud, but won't touch the elements that live on-prem. So we end up with multiple solutions, one backing up Exchange and SharePoint on-prem, one backing up Office 365 versions of. And then when it comes to recovery, there's the potential that we're going to one console to recover a certain set of users, another console to recover another set of users, another set of data. So I think I think that hybrid that hybrid capability to back up both the on-prem and public cloud, see all of that as one infrastructure, be able to choose where you restore stuff. I just think it's hugely important. And I mean, is that something you see appreciated amongst other Veeam enterprise customers?
Definitely. There's a lot of other solutions out there, and one of the biggest constraints that customers seem to run into is just storage lock-in or site lock-in, or you're locked into one configuration over another when your business is changing, especially when it comes to software as a service. Wherever that makes sense for your data entity to lie is where you're going to move that data. And if you don't have a solution that can be flexible and moving with you and your data, it could become a huge constraint, making sure that you have a different software for each of your move cycles and then learning two different softwares to complete just one task. The IT administrator nowadays wears too many hats to have to try to keep up with everything like that.
Yeah, and I think, like you say, the IT administrators are busy. There's a cost associated with that. We're having to learn and run with two separate solutions, with maybe two separate bits of infrastructure. So I do think it's a hugely valuable thing. But I think obviously we've spoken a lot. We've talked a lot about the whys and some of the technology problems around things like Teams as well, and some of the capability of deployment from Veeam. So maybe for those people who are watching this, maybe we should give them that treat of showing them exactly how Veeam goes about protecting and importantly recovering information inside of 365.
Now, whenever Veeam thinks about recovery, we have a great story. Our applications explorers actually started with Veeam backup and replication for an on-prem environment. And these same applications have been developed over the years to optimize them and make them the easiest to be able to use. And we also developed these explorers to use native types of formats. So, like with Exchange, you're able to export files if you need to as a PST file or an MSG file, which is exactly the same files that you would find if you were to export something from Outlook. Whenever it comes to SharePoint, we of course got sites and documents, OneDrive's just an external drive that you have cloud connected to your computer. And of course, Teams. We're going to talk about channels. We're going to talk about those permissions, tabs, settings that we're able to restore through that infrastructure. And I think that'll take us directly into the demo, like I think you were hinting at there. And we'll
Yeah, I
have
think we've
to.
we've got to treat people to actually see the technology. We can't just talk about it like it doesn't exist.
All right, so here is the Veeam backup for Microsoft Office 365 console. Just on surface level, it's very simple. It's very straightforward. Your organizations are added in here on the left, and to the right, you can create any kind of job that you would like to configure. I have a couple configured because I have a local backup, an Azure backup, and an AWS backup, meaning that I have them to different object storage repositories just to kind of see across the board because some of my data makes sense on one side versus the other. Now, coming into configuration, it's very simple, it's very straightforward, and you're able to granularly decide what you would like to add into your list, whether it's based on users, groups. So if you already have groups within your infrastructure, say a finance group, an IT group, and maybe an HR group, you could have all of these going to separate types of repositories and configurations under those groups in order to create a very finite billing process. So this can definitely help if you're wanting to move to object storage, but you have a departmental argument. Do we charge this department? Do we charge that department? Well, you can choose to dynamically charge each of those departments by setting up separate object storages for each of those. So very flexible on the types of data that you can group together. We also have teams and organizations. If you want different jobs to be able to back up, say, your entire organizational SharePoint sites in one go, you can granularly select under each of these options whether we're backing up the team sites, the OneDrive sites, and so on. Selecting exclude objects are just as granular, as well as your backup proxy and your configurations for how often that you want to run your job. You can set up your job to be able to run nearly continuously within a 5-minute interval of kicking that job off. And if it breaches that cycle, it'll immediately start another job after that. So we do offer continuous protection. You're not just locked into one group or the other, and you can create different SLA tiers as well. So coming out of here, taking a look at our Explorer, We can go across the entire organization for all of our team sites together. And in this demonstration, we're going to go ahead and delete a file and see how fast it is to go ahead and produce that file back. So we'll just come in here. I'm going to delete it. I don't need it anymore. I assume no one else in this channel needs it anymore. And now it's gone. Well, lo and behold, we come over here and I got a restore request because Violet needed that file. So we're going to come into the Teams application because she went ahead and put in a ticket saying, I need this file back. Let's assume we don't know where that file was originally. So we're just going to go into an advanced search option here. And we'll go ahead and make this nice and big. We have the option to search on post fields and file fields, meaning that we can come in here and choose, I know it's a file. I think I know what the name was because she said it was OSI, but I'm not sure if it contains that exact wording. So we're just going to search on OSI, and it's going to quickly search all of our team's locations here on the left, which is my entire organization at this point. So I don't need to know anything more than the file name to be able to get this file back to that user. And already right here, we're able to either restore and open that file, making sure it's the right file. We could go to different versions if there are multiple versions, and restoring the files back to the original location. Right here is that send feature I was talking about earlier. So if you do have a restore account, you can say, okay, I'm restoring back from my help desk email. I'm sending it to whoever requested it, and whatever your standard title is for your organization to be able to do that. All right, so when we go back to restore the file itself, it is going to ask for an administrator password to be able to restore that file back to the original location. After it's validated who you are, you have the option to either restore just the change items if you selected multiple items, missing items, or restoring just the latest version. There's some files that get updated constantly by several people, and these can have a long chain of restore history. This box allows you to be able to restore the latest version. If that's the only version the end user needs, it could save a ton of time and restore operations by just selecting the latest backup version. Again, this will only take about a few minutes to complete, and we'll see it directly back into the Teams itself. And once that's complete, we can see that the file is here and it says that it's successful. If you have multiple files and some of those fail for one reason or another, maybe that file's still in that location, it'll give you a warning letting you know. So we can come back over here and check to make sure that it is in fact within this file location, and we'll do a quick refresh. And we can see that the OSI model is back here. And of course, we have the OSI model in the best format possible. The last thing that we can take a look at here that gives you complete flexibility on how you would like to restore your teams is you can select to restore multiple teams at the same time. And you can select to restore all teams in your entire location. And whenever you are processing through these options, you have the chance to just restore the permissions themselves. So if you do have permissions that you need to go ahead and restore back to the original location, but not necessarily any types of documents or regulation or documents or files, then you're able to just restore those permissions back instead of having to remember exactly what was changed on that site before everyone lost access.
I think for anybody who's ever tried to restore teams, restore anything into teams, talking about kind of, as you were discussing earlier on, that methodology of maybe multiple steps to restore into teams because you're restoring from so many pieces, they're really going to appreciate just how straightforward it was to make the request, how straightforward it was to find the data and the information that you wanted to recover, and how easy and quickly it did that recovery. And obviously it was only a small example, so obviously the mileage will vary depending on how much data you're bringing back. But I think just the simplicity of it's in an interface that's easy and relatively easy for people to figure out how to use. It's pretty intuitive, it's easy to find the data, and it's easy to click restore and away you go. And I think for anybody who's either looked at Office 365 and maybe looked at solutions that don't have native support for Teams, they'll realize how difficult that is. And that's why I think it's always important people realize it shouldn't be brushed over, the importance of being able to recover Teams. And for anybody who's tried to recover Teams manually, you know, that's a real simple approach. So so that's a great demo, Rin. Really appreciate that. And so maybe for us to just to wrap up here, so if people who are watching this and are thinking, you know, maybe Veeam might be the right kind of solution for me. Maybe backing up Office 365 is absolutely crucial and core to what we're trying to do. What are some of the things that people should be looking at when it comes to selecting the right and appropriate solution to protect their Office 365 data?
So this actually comes down to 6 industry reasons, and I believe this was put out by IDC, and each of these categories are what you should be looking for in an Office 365 backup solution. It's your features, your flexibility, of course, innovation, making sure they're continuously adding the things that you need in your organization. Of course, scale. We scale up, we scale down depending on what type of business. We have projects that come in and out, of course, with many organizations. What do you integrate with, as well as breadth of service? Breadth of service really speaks to having a singular type of backup software to meet all of your needs so that you're not having to relearn all of these different types of restore procedures, whether you're working with a virtual machine, a infrastructure as a service types of virtual machines, if you're working with NAS storage, making sure that this covers all of the entities within your infrastructure within a similar type of platform. And this is how Veeam has been filling out the list here.
Yeah, so it seems like Veeam ticking lots of the boxes there. But you know, and I think it's important though that people look at when they're looking at protecting Office 365 that they have a set of criteria that they can work against to understand, like we said right at the start, you know, understand what Microsoft can do for you natively, see where the gaps lie in terms of what Microsoft can offer versus your data protection policies, your kind of internal enterprise policies and requirements. And if there's a gap, fill these kind of 6 features to make sure that you are filling that gap within a solution that's appropriate. So Rin, you know, I think that's been really useful. I think it's been some great insight into why we should protect Office 365, some of the complexities that we discussed around Teams, and kind of how Veeam are helping to fix these problems and address these issues for their customers. And if people want to find out a little bit more about what Veeam are doing in this space around backing up Office 365, or maybe if people would like to get in contact with you via Veeam, is a good way for them to do that.
Of course, we also have a great sales team. If you go to our website towards the top, you can put in a ticket to have a sales member to go over all of the details with you.
Okay, well that's great, Rin, and I'll make sure that we include in some kind of follow up information. And of course, for our customers here at Gardener Systems, of course, you can contact your Gardener Systems team, and we'll be more than happy to talk to you about how you should back up and protect Office 365 and some of the solutions that Veeam have that may well be the appropriate ones for you. And of course, you can find other information around Veeam, including some other on-demand videos that we've done via our website. But for now, Rin, really appreciate your time. Thank you for being on this on-demand video with us this time, and we look forward to having you again on in the future. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you found that useful. To find out more about how Gardener Systems can help you protect your Office 365 data, then contact us either via our website at gardenersystems.co.uk or contact your normal Gardener Systems representative. And to find out more about the technologies we work with, then why not check out more of our on-demand technology video series. Thanks for watching.